Live, and thank you anyone who's decided to watch this back. You might be watching it through YouTube or listening to it through 12 of the podcast channels, and of course on Facebook. So thank you. Very exciting show today because it's on a subject that is close to all of our hearts, and it's around the subject of sustainability. And we're going to be talking about that quite broadly, about the subject of sustainability. But our expert today, Aileen Ryan, Aileen, Aileen, Ryan, Ryan. You'll find her on LinkedIn. She's actually CEO of Preoptima, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit because it's quite exciting what they're doing in the built environment. And so, welcome, Aileen. Lovely to see you here with us. Before we get going, I'm going to give a little bit of context if you've not watched one of our podcasts before. Thomas and I record these twice a month, and we're interviewing experts. And the reason we do this is because a lot of us spend our time looking for clients, and I know that's very important, but actually there's nothing more important than making sure you've got the right suppliers so that your business is doing the right thing and is productive and efficient and is marketing itself well. So all the experts that we bring to you will help you to have a better business in many, many ways. And we find our experts within our community, BIP 100. BIP 100 stands for Business is Personal 100. And business is personal is a philosophy that Thomas and I have held for well over 25 years in our world of looking after business owners within communities. So BIP 100 is our community, which will never have more than 100 members in it. And we bring ourselves to it, and very much spending time with our members, connecting them, supporting them, helping them grow in various ways. So that's my blurb about us and why you are listening to this particular show. But now let's get on to the subject here. Now, let's start with Aileen. You help us understand a little bit about the context of why you are so passionate about sustainability and what's brought you to this part of your journey in life.
Thanks, Penny, and thanks for inviting me to do this. It's been actually really useful for me personally to rethink my journey and how did I get here? How did I arrive at this point? So first of all, I suppose, why am I passionate about sustainability? Well, I live on a planet that where humans have played a not particularly positive role, particularly over the last, let's say, 100 years. But to kind of wind the clock back, almost 20 years ago now, I watched Al Gore's first documentary movie, which was called An Inconvenient Truth. And if anybody hasn't watched that and the sequel to it, I strongly recommend it. It's just a fantastic piece of documentary movie making. And I found it tremendously inspiring, but also sobering, because he's so clear on the facts of what we are doing to our environment, and crystal clear that it is humans, it's human activity that has started to put us on a path towards potentially climate catastrophe. And having watched that movie, quite shortly after it, I remember I was at a very lovely dinner in a very lovely restaurant, and I was chatting about this movie to a woman that I didn't know, and she absolutely stunned me by saying, but that's not real, climate change isn't really happening, climate's always got hotter, got colder, it's just a natural cycle, Al Gore, that's just incorrect. And it really stunned me, and I kind of got into an argument with her about it, because for me that movie had been so compelling and so convincing that I now was on the side of, I can't believe you're denying this. And I think and hope that by now, 20 years later, almost nobody is able to deny climate change or deny the link with human activity and climate change. We see all around us in the world unseasonable weather patterns, storms, hurricanes, extreme heat, like last week in Spain, 40 degrees in Spain in April, like that's just unheard of, or even last summer in the UK and across Europe. So I think that climate change denial has gone away. in 2009, I was lucky enough to sail across the Atlantic with my brother from New York back to the UK. And that was an amazing trip on so many different fronts. But one of my memories was that hundreds of miles out into the ocean, we were still seeing plastic pollution. So we were seeing the remnants of helium balloons, for example, is one of the things that really just stayed with me after that trip, that the impact of human activity was visible in a place where, you know, there were no humans around for days on end, and yet there was signs of human destruction of our world in that place, kind of in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And that was a reminder to me that, yeah, you know, it's maybe you need to do something, right? So having listened to Al Gore back in 2005, 2006, that idea I had allowed it become dormant effectively. So since then, I've had a little boy, and I would say motherhood has really made me think again about the state of the planet that we're leaving for the next generation. And so I embarked on educating myself. There's an institution called the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, CISL, which they call CISL, which I think is quite nice. And so I undertook some kind of education there. And there I really learned about the effects of climate change on food and water security, on public health, on our children, on the economically disadvantaged around the world. And the impacts of climate change are very severe and unfortunately disproportionate. So the wealthy nations are not suffering at all to the same extent as the developing nations, where we're seeing, you know, devastated crops of wheat and vegetables and fruits, heat illnesses, and still an enormous number of people living in poverty. And they're not the people, or they're the people who are probably least responsible for climate change, but they're disproportionately affected. And so I, in the last few years, have really focused my energies, both personally and professionally, on this area of sustainability and how we can make a difference for the planet and for the generations that come after us.
Wow. That has to be one of the most substantial answers, providing so much context, but so much depth to why this matters to you. It's not like you just decided to pick up a banner and go up to London and say, I care about, you know, this is deep commitment you've got here, Aileen. And so actually, I'm really curious that there's this Paris Agreement focused on 2050, which, you know, as a lay person, passionate about lots of things, but certainly not about the depth of knowledge that you have. This is getting so much attention now. So can you just give us a little bit of an understanding of this Paris Agreement, and also, you know, why there is so much attention on this 2030 point?
Yeah, you're right, Penny, and it is a source of confusion, I think, that we talk about 2050 for the Paris Agreement, but a lot of our actions and activities are focused on a different date, which is 2030. So the Paris Agreement was signed back a number of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago now, and it was all of the larger nations in the world coming together, as they do from a political point of view, and really making commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that by 2050 we on a global basis stay under another magic number, which is 1.5 degrees of warming. So now 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like a lot. In fact, you know, if you go outside today and it's 14 degrees and you go outside tomorrow and 15.5 degrees, it's barely noticeable really for a human being. But on a planetary basis, that's a very meaningful number. And it doesn't mean that the whole planet everywhere is just, you know, temperatures are just generally going to rise by 1.5 degrees. Unfortunately, just the way that the geography and the mechanics of our globe work, it means that some areas will be much warmer and some areas will be much colder. So we'll see an exacerbated melting, for example, of ice caps, because those areas should be very cold and they're going to get warm. And as a result of that, we'll see impacts on, for example, ocean currents like the Gulf Stream. And so even though 1.5 degrees sounds like it hardly would make a difference, in fact, the difference it's going to make to our societies globally are literally catastrophic. So 1.5 degrees global warming is like an absolute limit that nobody would ever want to go above that point. So the leaders, political leaders, came together and said, okay, let's set ourselves a goal that we're going to, by 2050, stay below 1.5 degrees of global warming. Now, what coming back from that, what would be the milestones and the project plan, in effect, that we would need to deliver in order to know that by because we're not just going to leave it till 2049 and say, right, what are we going to do now, boys and girls, right? We need to make a much more deliberate progress towards those goals so that we know that we're on track and we can course correct if we're not. And 2030 is a particularly important big milestone. And one of the reasons why 2030 is a big milestone is because there's an asymmetry in climatic effects. So if we put a ton of carbon into the atmosphere today, and we say, yeah, that's okay, because we're working on technologies which will allow us in 20 years' time to suck that 1 ton of carbon out of the atmosphere again. So it'll all be okay because technology is going to be able to solve it in the future. That sounds like it's logical, but unfortunately, between now, when we emit that ton of carbon, and 20 years' time, when we hope and expect that we'll be able to remove that ton of carbon from the atmosphere, that ton of carbon is causing a spiral of impacts, right? So it is adding to the warming of our environment for those 20 years. And by the way, we don't even know for sure we will be able to remove that ton of carbon in 20 years' time. So it's a bit of a hope, a bit of a promise. But even if it were true, 1 ton of carbon today is not the same as 1 ton of carbon in 20 years' time. So as a result, there are milestones associated with 2030, which is kind of like a point of inflection. If we don't hit our 2030 milestones, then we really have to think again about how we're going to make our commitment of staying below 1.5 degrees of global warming by 2050. So it's a really important date from that point of view. It's like a point of inflection. If we haven't started well down our journey to net zero by 2030, then the damage we continue to do to our environment is almost irreversible by 2050.
And are we on course?
No.
We're not on course.
No.
Oh dear.
So you work, and I want to come to this in a minute. You work around construction and the built environment. So I want to come to that because you're making a difference in that environment with the solution that you've created. But before we get to that, which industry sectors, will have the greatest impact? As Thomas said, are we on course? So, as a consumer, I'm thinking, should I fly? What are the things I should be doing? And what industries could have the most impact on reaching that if they stood up and took responsibility?
Yeah, so flying, of course, gets a lot of bad press, really, but there's a fantastic resource which is called Project Drawdown. It's a web-based resource. It was the result of many years of incredibly knowledgeable people working together to kind of analyze and unpack this problem of where are the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which sectors. And when you look at that material, there's a book, but also a website associated with it they provide some really fantastic pointers in terms of where should we be looking for the biggest culprits. And when I use the word culprit, I don't mean that in like you're bad and you're good. I mean, if we understand the biggest contributors, then that's where we can have the most impact on when we turn our attention to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in those sectors. So what we see is that in general, energy, so energy consumed for electricity and heat, that's the single biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Next, it's transportation, so cars and shipping, not actually including aviation in there at all. Aviation is its own separate category. So transportation in general, transportation of the goods that we consume, transportation of people, etc. The third segment that they pick out in priority order is buildings or the built environment. So that's also a massive contributor to greenhouse gases. Fourth is manufacturing. So, you think about the energy for manufacturing steel, which of course is used in the built environment, and it's used for vehicles, and it's used for making ships and containers, and the energy associated with making glazing for our buildings, the energy associated with making chemicals like fertilizers, and the energy associated with making textiles, the energy associated with mining and quarrying for cement, and also the additional greenhouse gases that result from interfering with the surface of our planet when we undertake those activities. Agriculture, so deforestation, obviously we're losing what would be called carbon sinks by deforestation. We undertake crop burning, which is hugely detrimental to the planet. So burning off the stubble or the remnants of plants that we've grown and harvested. Rice cultivation, interestingly, is one that's non-intuitive. So when we flood land in order to grow rice, the act of flooding land actually produces a lot of and releases a lot of methane, and methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas, much more detrimental greenhouse gas than carbon is. And so, there are a lot of very intricate interactions between various aspects of our planet. And what surprised me when I did the course in Cambridge was a lot of things that we maybe intuitively think, well, that's good, eating rice is good, surely it's better than eating livestock, or and we're kind of led to believe that. But actually, once you unpeel that onion, you find that, oh, wait a minute, that's not quite as straightforward. It's not a direct, you can't join the dots directly between those things, and you have to dig into it. So in short, aviation is quite a long way down the priority order. And we do hear a lot about aviation, and it's one of those, I don't know, there's a term, enfant terrible, right? It's something that we can sort of pinpoint and feel better, like I didn't take that flight, or I paid carbon offsets for my flight, so therefore I've done my piece, right? It's something that we can put in a box, and it's somewhat easy to understand, but and we need to address all aspects of our lives, but aviation is not going to be the most impactful place for us to focus our attention.
Gosh, that's really interesting. You can reel those off, because anybody that's not watching this, Aileen's not got a Bible in front of her where she's reading off all these facts. These are all in her head, which is incredible. So I love the fact that you list this. And so I've got two questions. I don't know which way to go first. One is, I would love to know at some point how you've changed your behaviours as a consumer.
That's a good question.
Really interesting. But the other one I think maybe we should address first is, so Thomas and I might be investing in a new development, a new property. How would we go about asking them, and this is where we take you to Preoptima, that you're the CEO of this new amazing tech startup in the, what would you call it? What tech? There must be a name for it, something tech.
Prop tech.
Prop tech.
Prop tech. Prop tech.
Yeah, and I know you've just achieved great funding for this. So you said buildings was the number 3 culprit.
Yes.
So you've built Preoptima, you're building Preoptima. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And also, you know, any of us, if we were going out to buy a new property or invest in a new property, what questions would we actually ask to see whether or not they are being responsible?
Yeah, so you're right. Buildings is a huge impact on our environment, and we can divide buildings or building stock, housing stock, or building stock, I suppose, into 2 things quite obviously. One is new buildings and one is existing buildings. And I don't know if you know that we globally are building the equivalent of New York City every month.
I find that mind-blowing when you say that, Aileen.
Yeah, it is. So all 5 boroughs of New York City, we are building brand new every month. And
somewhere in the world.
Somewhere in the world, yeah, exactly. And when we look at the emissions associated with any building, we divide again that up into 2 categories. One is embodied carbon, and embodied carbon is the carbon in the building itself. So in the steel, in the concrete, in the glazing, in the,
the
mechanical, electrical, plumbing kind of materials, in the bricks, etc. So embodied carbon is like a sunk cost. When you get the keys to your new building, there is almost nothing you can do about the embodied carbon, right? It's sunk, it's done. You now own a chunk of embodied carbon and you can't really do anything about that. And then the second category of carbon is called operational carbon, and operational carbon is the carbon that we use on a day-to-day basis to run our building. So heating the kettle, or running our computers, or running the central heating, etc., etc. And embodied carbon, just again, to put things in context, we talked about 1.5 degrees of global warming and building New York City every month. Just the embodied carbon of those new buildings that we need to build, because we globally are in a time of population increase, and we're also in a time of increased urbanization. So just the embodied carbon that we will use to build those buildings for all those new people who want to live in urban areas between now and 2050, that's going to consume 80% of the 2050 carbon budget to stay below 1.5 degrees global warming, unless we do something radically different, right? So before we heat buildings.
Oh, wow. That's before all the other categories.
For all the other categories, yeah.
So is that the largest contributor to the waste?
It's one of them, but no, unfortunately, there are lots of things that consume 50% or more of the total carbon budget, which is why we need to look across all the different sectors and make every ounce of impact that we possibly can everywhere.
So tell us about, so the operational carbon is the piece that we as consumers can consider. How often do we put the dishwasher on? How often do we do the washing machine? How hot do we keep the house? How much water do we have in the kettle? All of these.
Yes, exactly.
We can take personal responsibility.
Yeah, but embodied carbon has to be addressed before, really as early as possible, right? So at the time of the building concept, we need to already be thinking about what's the carbon, the greenhouse gas emissions going to be associated with this building.
How can they reduce that? Is this what Preoptima is doing?
They buy Preoptima, exactly.
So here I am, I'm a developer, and I'm a conscious developer. I don't know whether there are legislations yet that force me.
There are. So regulation is coming fast because it's a hugely impactful environment, and so regulation is coming fast. There are about globally 120 different regulations associated with reducing embodied carbon in different countries and different political blocs like the European Union and different states, like in the United States, states are regulating independent of each other. Now that's a good thing because there's lots of regulation happening, but it's a bad thing because none of the regulation is the same and there's a lack of standardization. In the UK, there has been legislation associated with this that's been in front of Parliament already at least twice, but has not passed yet. But some, if we're looking for green shoots, some cities, quite a lot of cities actually, are moving ahead of regulation. So the city authorities are saying, well, Mr. Mrs. Government, you can regulate whenever you're ready to. In the meantime, I'm going to put my own local, you can't call it regulation or legislation, but my own local rules.
The way that they'll give planning permissions.
Exactly. So, and London happens to be one of the most progressive cities. Quite recently, there's also been very comprehensive legislation in New York City, which is called Local Law 97. So yes, regulation is coming and it's going to bite hard. But as with all legislation, it's slower than it needs to be.
And what can be done? Because how can you build something without steel, concrete, glass, electrics? How can you do it?
Yeah, so I mean, there are lots of ways that you can lower the carbon associated with new buildings, and with Preoptima, it's a software tool, and basically from the very first time that you draw a shape of a building, but you don't know, am I going to build it with steel? Am I going to build it with concrete? Am I going to build it with timber? Am I going to build it with some new, more environmentally friendly materials? How much glazing am I going to have on it? What kind of glazing am I going to have on it, for example? So before you lock in any of those decisions, Preoptima will tell you, first of all, what's the embodied carbon. So it will calculate all of the material quantities that you need in order to build that building in a structurally sound manner, in compliance with anything that we need to be aware of locally. Like, for example, if it's a seismic zone, that means the structural equations are a bit different than if it's not a seismic zone. If it's a flood zone, that impacts how you would go about structuring that building. So we will use the proper structural equations, the proper mathematics effectively for that particular location. And
so it's optimizing carbon for new builds.
Optimizing carbon using AI, yeah.
Wow, amazing. And you have two incredible academics, haven't you, that are involved in this? Tell us a little bit about them.
Yes, I do. Francesco Pomponi and Bernardino D'Amico, two Italians who've been researching this area together for the last decade. And they had been becoming increasingly frustrated that even though they're extremely widely published and cited in academic papers, industry, so the construction industry, the engineering industry, the architecture industry, was not yet picking up on those ideas and recommendations. And really, that sector is called AEC, architecture, engineering and construction. The AEC sector, they're all bright people. They know that the built environment is a massive impact from a sustainability point of view, and they want to do the right thing. But so far, they've not had a tool that can really help them at the right time, which is as early as possible in the design stage, where you can really make the most impact. And so it was really through meeting Bernardino and Francesco in Cambridge that we decided, yes, this is the right place to focus our professional capability for the next number of years.
Oh, so you met them on the Sizzle course?
I met them through an accelerator in Cambridge, yeah.
How amazing.
I see. Oh, the story is complete.
Really, destiny, isn't it? How fantastic. It shows the importance of going into little communities and finding the right people. So this word, when I hear the word greenwashing, okay, I assume that's actually, if you said to someone, "Oh, you greenwash that would be like a real, oh dear." Yeah. Tell me more about what this phrase greenwashing means.
Yeah, so greenwashing is kind of a, well, the phrase itself means that I don't know, you have a pig. I don't know, don't know why I've chosen pig, but you have a pig and a pig is pink, but you paint the pink pig green, and so now it looks like it's sustainable, right? But actually it's exactly the same thing. So greenwashing is a term that just refers to people maybe somewhat artificially or somewhat misleadingly implying that their product is now in some way green or good for the environment. And
they're just doing a little label over it, really, for marketing reasons and for CSR,
yeah,
to make them look good.
There's a lot of that in the supermarket in FMCG products.
There's a lot of it everywhere, Thomas. So, and when you see the word new, greener, then and usually they'll have pictures of a tree or a plant or something on it as well. Well, greener might mean, it's 1% better than it was yesterday. It doesn't actually mean it's good. It just means it's better than it was, right? Give me a star because I've done a little bit better. But, it can be very clever and very misleading. But there are, and that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but actually greenwashing has some very serious impacts. So, we see huge, highly pollutant organizations like the petrochemical companies, right? There was a lot of uproar and continues to be about, for example, Shell. And I don't mean to name and shame any one company, but Shell is a good example, but there are similar examples for all of them. But Shell was called out last year when they published their market forecasts because in their business plan, whilst a lot of their annual report was focused on what they're doing to increase renewable energy sources, their entire business plans, all of the numbers that they were committing to the market, to the shareholders, had a little asterisk. And when you read the asterisk in the small print at the bottom of the page, it said, does not include any transition to renewables. So, they kind of lead you to believe that they're on this journey, but actually, when you dig into it, their business plan is business as usual. That's how they're expecting.
Legal disclosure, to say.
Yeah.
So, because I can see what you mean about it being the sort of really evil, because it is misleading us all as consumers that might be wanting to do right. And so I really can understand that. So as we go, sorry,
I was just going to say, we also see it in relation to the carbon offset sector, and so people paying extra money, like I mentioned, for flying. You generally, when you book a flight, you have an option to say add on an extra certain amount of money to offset the cost of your flight. Well, that's kind of good, but you really need to know where is that offset going to. And again, like I said, that the AEC sector is very willing to change. They're just hamstrung because they don't have the right tools. The same can be said where airlines, they want to do the right thing. They want to invest the offset money in things that will literally offset the damage that's associated with the carbon consumed for that flight. But a lot of the people who take the offset money and then claim to invest it in good things, right, reforestation, etc. Again, there have been a lot of scandals about the low success rates of those projects. So again, there are some systemic issues which lead to greenwashing, and we need to fix those.
Wow, yeah, that's very, very powerful to share that here. Actually,
you're a serious expert, Aileen.
Yeah, it's about this education. You're educating us all here. So as we go to the top of the show, my goodness, we've gone fast actually here. I would love to know, so as in our personal lives and also as business owners, a lot of our members and connections are business owners, what's within our gift to do to make a difference?
Okay, well, I'll take the personal ones first. So first of all, I would say think about the power of your pound. Think about the power of your money. So a lot of us, if we're lucky, have money invested in pension funds, for example. So ask your pension provider, what are you investing in? Are you investing in green things? Are you investing in petrochemical companies? Are you investing in companies who claim to be one thing, but under the surface, they're not, right? So putting pressure on for investment of your money into areas of sustainable investment is a very impactful thing that you can do. Putting pressure on your energy provider, right? So we all know energy is super expensive right now, and unfortunately, as a result of that, there's been a bit of a return to non-green ways of producing energy. So there have been, for example, coal mines reopened in the last 12 months, which is understandable but hugely disappointing. So putting pressure on your energy provider for to continue their path towards renewable energy sources. And then think about the power of your personal consumption. So waste less. Do we need to buy that? Do we need to make that trip? Do I need to eat that? Do I need to use it? Do I need the heating this high? Can I wear a jumper? Have I got something that I'm about to throw out? Can I repair it? Can I walk or take a bike or take a scooter or take public transport instead of driving my car? Think about secondhand. Are there any viable secondhand alternatives to what, the thing that you are feeling like you want to buy? To go back to your house or your building, Penny, that you were talking about, one of the things with existing buildings is I talked about operational carbon. So if you feel like I do at home, I live in an old building, and it's not the warmest. It's, it hasn't got modern day construction methods, so it loses heat. And because it's losing heat, I'm spending extra money on operational energy to keep it warm. And there's a temptation to do things like maybe replace windows with triple glazing or put extra insulation in the attic or in the walls, etc. And these are actually, again, coming back to the term greenwashing, we're led to believe that these are jolly good things to do, aren't they? And a good place to invest. But actually, there's a phrase which is whole life carbon, which is very important. And you asked about what questions to ask. Asking about whole life carbon impacts is very important and powerful. You probably will get a blank stare when you ask that question. But if we think about changing double glazing to triple glazing, for example, yes, you save on your day-to-day energy costs because triple glazing will keep your home a bit warmer. But the embodied carbon in triple glazing is massive. So the amount of energy that's needed to manufacture triple glazing is enormous. And so when you make the change on your windows, what you're doing to the planet actually is you're giving the planet a carbon spike, right? You're giving your home a carbon spike. You're now saying, I'm the proud owner of more embodied carbon today than I was yesterday. But it's going to save me £10 a month on my operational energy. But actually, the payback for the planet in carbon terms of changing double to triple glazing in the UK is somewhere between 17 and 20 years. And that's a statistic from the glazing industry itself. So think, it's so easy to be misled, and you think you're doing the right thing. And actually, it can be quite devastating when you find out you haven't done the right thing.
Wow.
So, carrying on that, before we go on to what business owners can do, what do you think about solar panels on houses and things? Is there any chance that that's greenwashing as well?
I wouldn't call that greenwashing, but undoubtedly there are embodied carbon impacts to solar panels, and it's important to ask that whole life carbon impact question. But I think solar panels versus triple glazing, the payback is better.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Wow. So I hope everybody's loving this. I'm loving this education. I'm thinking about all the people I want to share this show to, actually. So let's finish off with, as business owners or as people in a business that maybe not be the owner, but you might be able to influence your senior management. What are the sort of things that we should be thinking of?
Yeah, so bigger organizations in general, you'll hear and you'll see in their annual reports that they have made commitments to being on a net zero journey. You might have heard the phrase science-based targets, which is there's an organization which helps you understand where are you today and how do you scientifically set yourself targets that are achievable for your business. And there's a really nice categorization, again, which you've probably heard of, which is you'll have heard people talking about focusing on their scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. And so those are terms that, I think every organization should be at least familiar with and decide whether to what extent are they appropriate for the size of your buildings. So scope 1 emissions, for example, is the emissions that you make directly. For example, running your boilers or vehicles or machinery in your factory. Scope 2 are the emissions associated with the energy that you consume. So when you buy energy from provider A versus provider B, depending on the carbon intensity of the energy that you're buying, that's your scope 2 emissions. Unfortunately, really, scope 3 is everything else, right? So scope 3 is everything you buy from your suppliers. It's how do your staff get to work every day? It's what happens when my product goes out into the big bad world, and does it do good or does it incur additional greenhouse gas emissions? And so scope 3 tends to be really very complex for people to get their head around, but nonetheless it is useful. It's a useful exercise just to think about, well, if it were my business, what do I do that falls into each of those categories, and what should I consider doing about it? But on a very simple basis for smaller organizations like many of us run, think about questions like, are you paying to heat an office space, but all of your team is at home on Monday and Friday, right? So are you heating space and there's nobody in it? Are you paying energy costs that are actually not necessary and consuming energy that isn't necessary? Think about, how do staff get to work? Walmart, actually, in the US, massive organization, as you know, are building a new headquarters, and they're very deliberately building it with cycle lanes and lots of incentives for their staff to be able to cycle to work, and building in a location where it's easy for the majority of their staff to get to work. Think about, bizarrely, your website and where your data is stored and the data center that stores your data. Have you asked any questions of those providers about the carbon intensity that they're using? And of course, other things like company cars and flights, merchandise, right? But it's really, once, as you said, I am pretty passionate about it, and I've probably spent way too long talking about the details, but once you get going on this subject, you can't really stop.
It's phenomenal.
It is phenomenal. I mean, you've given us so much to think about, and I'm thrilled that we've got this show and our podcast, and I know a lot of people will enjoy listening to this because it affects all of us. So I think it's powerful, really powerful. I'm trying to think of the list of things I can do. To begin with, in a tiny way, I should at least make sure that Amazon doesn't deliver every day with one packet of staples or one this or that. We've really got to start grouping up and only having one delivery a week or something. That's for sure. Amazingly powerful. So anybody who is interested in chatting to Aileen, or maybe has some connections in this built environment, I'd love you to spread the word about the show and about Aileen. You can connect with Aileen on LinkedIn, Aileen Ryan. Can obviously contact Thomas or myself if you'd like us to make a connection for you to Aileen. But I know you've just travelled over to Boston to do some work there. And then the week after next, you're in Japan. So I know that you're a busy lady. To have given us this time, Aileen, has been incredible, and you've educated us all. So
thank you. And if anyone wants help or advice about how to think about their business in sustainable terms, I'm super happy to.
That's very generous. That's very generous, because I know that's not your main business focus. So that reflects your passion for this subject. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for listening. Please spread the word about this show, because it is powerful and we can all make a difference if we're educated. I think that is the key thing. So many, many thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day or evening, depending on what time you're listening to this.
Thanks a lot, guys.